Hello, everyone. We are going to start almost right on time here because we have quite a packed roundtable coming up. So I am not going to delay at all. I'm just going to hand things over to my colleague Bozena Shallcross, who will be conducting the roundtable, and take over from here, Bozena.
Thank you, Bill. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Bozena Shallcross, and this roundtable thematically is a continuation of the panel that took place in the morning, but its participants are a quite different group of people, quite a different constellation. And let me just go briefly through that list. So this also reflects the order of appearance. So the first is Laimonas Briedis. Am I?
Yes, correct.
Thank you. Who has this great honor of being a native of Vilnius. He's a writer and an author of the book, Vilnius, the City of Strangers. The next person is Professor Irena Grudzińska-Gross, currently affiliated with the Polish Academy of Sciences and Letters, a person who has received many honors, among them the Guggenheim Foundation Award, is an author of numerous books, including a book that is a comparison between Miłosz and Brodsky in terms of the magnetic field between them. After Professor Gross, we have Professor Aleksandra Kremer, Harvard University, who is a specialist, a neo-formalist interpreter of poetic texts. I am not sure that she is present. Yes, okay, good. I was for a moment uncertain. Thank you so much. And Łukasz Tischner will follow. Professor Łukasz Tischner of Jagiellonian University, some people pronounce, is a scholar of the subjective turn in religion, religiosity. Among his books is a book on Gombrowicz, and this is followed by Professor Joanna Zach, who was not only a close friend of Czesław Miłosz and a frequent visitor with Professor Fiut, a frequent visitor of Czesław Miłosz. That's what I've just recently learned from one of the videos that Fiut and Toni Miłosz put together. Professor Joanna Zach is an unquestionable authority about all things Miłoszian. And the last panelist is Renata Gorczyńska, a very well-known journalist, translator, author, also a person who is will be forever associated with the name of Czesław Miłosz. And she will be talking about Vilna. So the idea was that we start with Vilnius, and then in a sort of a circularity, we conclude our roundtable with the pre-war Vilna of Czesław Miłosz. So we have very little time. So without further ado, I would like to invite Laimonas Briedis.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and it's a great honor to be among all of you. And I'm in Chicago, but I live in Vancouver actually, so I'm sort of kind of like here now. I am a cultural geographer, so maybe my approach is a little bit different than sort of a literary critic or literary analyst. And so anyway, I nonetheless, I sort of kind of read Lithuania, if you want to call it, and especially the city of Vilnius, through kind of Miłosz writings, not just poetry, but prose. So in a way, I'm trying to navigate through sort of kind of like Miloshian, if you want to call it that, landscape of the city. It is a important, I think, to stress that that was yesterday, we were having a wonderful book presentation about Miłosz in California, that when sort of we talk about Miłosz and his relationship with the Poetics of place, we always have to bring into the notion of exile. And I think perhaps I will start from that, a little bit kind of unraveling and questioning this sort of kind of notion exile. First of all, it's valuable to think from where Miłosz was, so to speak, exile, and where was to exile. Now I don't want to dwell mostly on the question where was it exile, but perhaps more importantly, this in relationship to Lithuania and Vilnius, where was the exile from? So on the broader spectrum, when he came to the United States of America, when he defected, so to speak, from his job as a Polish embassy, he was seen, and I think continues to be seen, and probably more or less his career as a professor was built on that he's just in sort of kind of an exile from this sort of a communist rule area, which by definition was meant obviously East Europe. So he was a more or less probably refugee from East Europe rather than exile from East Europe. Now, if we look at the sort of a more detail, Miłosz probably would object to some extent to that notion. But if we look a little bit more kind of detail, then of course it emerges that he was a refugee, rather probably an exile from Poland, because probably in our terminology, an exile and a refugee has several different meanings. And just obviously to give you just kind of an example, when we talk about the history of Poland in particular, then more or less probably people who were sort of exiled to Siberia, so to speak, and refugees more or less ended up in the West. And there's as you know, also a great tradition, of course, a history of sort of Polish refugees and migration, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this does not necessarily answer the question, because for Miłosz himself and in the Polish context, he was, first of all, probably an exile or refugee from what can be considered to be Kresy and more or less kind of like eastern part of Poland. Now, for Miłosz, probably if you kind of read it, if I'm correctly reading him, that in itself is not necessarily the answer. I think he builds on this notion that he is an exile from more or less the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which by the time, of course, when he was born, ceased to exist for more than 100 years. So in the way, his form of exile kind of like zeroes down and narrows down is from two places. One of the places is, of course, his more or less birthplace and where he kind of like experienced as a child. Mostly is Shatani and the Nevėžis River Valley, which becomes sort of kind of almost this Arcadian notion, obviously, in his poetry. But nonetheless, when I remember yesterday, Cynthia talking about, Miłosz wanted to be naturalist, so to speak, rather than perhaps a poet, at least initially he imagined this. And of course, that notion of being a naturalist emerged from growing up in that sort of area, which is coincidentally as beautiful as it is, and bucolic. It's not necessarily the most beautiful spot, if you want to call it, in Lithuania, or for that matter, in that bigger area of Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And Miłosz's sense of exile from the sort of that area specifically, which is now in the middle of Lithuania, from Nevėžis River Valley, arose, as he writes in some of the poetry, quite very early and in some prose, that he, even when he was already kind of a student, and I mean, gymnasium student in Vilna, he already looked, as he said, over the hills into that world. And this is very important to remember that, of course, there was already a political boundary between, so to speak, that part of the world that he was exiled from, at least he imagined or felt that he is exiled from, that rural part of Lithuania, and the city of Vilna, which was in part of Poland, where the Nevėžio River remained in Lithuania. So he builds on that notion of exile from quite early on. And so, but nonetheless, when he talks about home, he stresses that his home is the city of Vilna. And I have to stress it, of course, and I'm glad that Renata perhaps going to say more about that or something like that, that of course, when he talks about the city of Vilna, he doesn't necessarily talk about the city of Vilnius, because that is the very important kind of distinction. And so in a way, what he poetically recreates or attempts to recreate or attempts to imagine is actually that's kind of like the city of Vilna rather than the city of Vilnius, which is not necessarily also that the Vilnius, sort of to speak, replaced Vilna. The both of those places kind of emerge parallel, perhaps, at the time. And he admitted himself that, you know, he kind of imagined that if he had an option to be either Lithuanian or Polish writer or Polish-Lithuanian poet, then of course, even mentioning yesterday, again, we mentioned that, you know, he says that he wrote in some kind of, while writing in California, that he wrote in some kind of like unknown language. But imagine if he was writing in Lithuanian, so to speak. So, and he literally said, of course, that that would be limiting his potentials with Lithuanian language and Lithuanian literature. Now, we can argue about that, and I think we can sort of dissect that notion, but that's not the most important thing, in my opinion. The important thing, actually, what later in life, Miłosz seems to be aware that the reality, what he's probably as exile, is not necessarily from the kind of Vilna, or for that matter from Vilnius, which is sort of like, but from the part of the city that he witnessed to, but had very little knowledge of. And this is the Yiddish part or Jewish part of Vilna. And I'm not trying to say that he, you know, was kind of literally exiled that, but what strikes me, two notions. One of them, I remember like looking at the archives in Beinecke Library, and there was a correspondence between Chaim Grades, who is the Yiddish writer from Vilna, and between Miłosz and Grades' wife, and then subsequently widow. And Grades' wife sent English translations of Vilnius or Vilna, sort of kind of narratives of Grade. And Miłosz responded in letters that this completely sort of kind of opened a new world for him. So this was something that he saw, but never knew. And it's interesting to me that in a similar fashion, for example, if I can compare to myself, I start to learn and recognize about Vilna through Miłosz, because I grew up in Vilnius, so as Bozena mentioned, and so I grew up in Soviet Vilnius, where basically this kind of notion of Polish Vilna was completely erased, or at least it was made invisible. That's not necessary, it's not true that it was erased. But nonetheless, so that I learned about this missing part, if you want to call it, or forgotten parts or erased part of Lithuanian Vilnius, reading Miłosz in English. And to me strikes as, you know, that Miłosz sort of kind of like learns about this Yiddish Jewish part of Vilnius, Vilna, also reading in English. And somehow, somewhere, I think that's kind of like interestingly, you know, constellations, some kind of interesting constellations, how it's almost kind of a neutral language. English allows it to penetrate kind of areas that perhaps for those even who are native of that city, it's sort of, you know, becomes specifically because of linguistic oppositions, if you want to call that, you know, kind of incomprehensible. So what what another sort of kind of like idea Miłosz put, I think this is pretty much when he was writing about the conflict between Lithuanian and Polish over Vilnius or over Vilna, which is completely incomprehensible, obviously, for the rest of the world in many ways. Where he said that actually the real tragedy, the real loss, if you want to call it the real exile that we all exiled from, is actually what happened in Ponar outside Vilnius, where he, as a young man, experienced kind of pleasures of summer, and it became mass grave of Jewish, mostly Jewish, but also it's important to stress Polish and Lithuanian, Vilna and Vilnius. So maybe on that note, because obviously Miłosz brings all these kind of eschatological notions of memory and how to build on that. Maybe on that note, I would say that, this is sort of kind of what's missing, and he acknowledges that is the missing from his old writings, and perhaps from his even understanding, is this basically Jewish Yiddish Vilna.
Thank you so much. I think that we, after the presentations, will have a chance to discuss your main thesis. And at this point, I would like to invite Professor Grudzińska-Gross. And
thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be coming after this first presentation because I'm going to, in a way, continue similar subject, but from another point of view, and not in Vilnius, but in Warsaw. Because it was mentioned already this morning, Miłosz spent the Second World War, most of it, 4 years of it, in Warsaw, and was the only Polish language poet who was at that time in Warsaw, who wrote about the extermination of Jews. There is one poem by Marian Jacobski that was written about this subject, but it was written later. It was written in 1945, and there was, of course, poetry of Krzysztof Kamil-Baczyński, but this was, first of all, his mother was Jewish, so it's a slightly different situation. The second thing is that he wrote without mentioning Jews ever in his poetry, so his poetry is now ascribed to the Warsaw insurrection, Warsaw uprising, which he was killed in the fourth day of that uprising, so he didn't manage to write anything. So I want to talk about three canonical poems that were written during the Second World War by Czesław Miłosz, two canonical and one that I would like to add. And these poems are Campo di Fiori, Poor Paul looks at the ghetto, and then the third one from the same, not only from the same volume of poetry, but also from the same section of that volume, which is called Outskirts, Przedmieście. These poems are to be put together as Holocaust poems, which I want first to somehow speak about this kind of concentration of them in one group. But I don't have time really to neither to read these poems to you, nor really to summarize them properly. So the summary for those of you who do not remember them, this summary will kind of come out of my preparation, since I have only 10 minutes to talk about this incredibly complicated subject. So the first question that I would like to answer, if some of my friends were really actually contesting me on that, that is what is this meaning of putting these three poems all together? Is this useful to do it? And I think that it is right to put these three poems because one of the main reasons is that shows that although Miłosz was unique in this shows his uniqueness too, his kind of I would say, sensibility that was very special. And but also the fact is that these poems were the reception of these poets makes them special and makes them very much linked with this topic. That is, as you know, Campo di Fiori was a poem that was considered by the Jewish survivors of the insurrection uprising in Warsaw, and then later on too, in the reception, was considered as a really unique sign of solidarity from the non-Jewish writing world in Warsaw at that time. The second, so that Campo di Fiori, as the critic Nathan Gross is writing, Campo di Fiori was the favorite, in a way, poem from the war of a Jewish reading public. Now, as far as the second poem, the poem A Poor Paul is looking at the ghetto, this poem had such an explosive role in starting a debate in Poland, started in 1987 by Jan Błoński with a text that has is a really kind of changed quotation from the poem, starting the discussion about the possible co-responsibility of either Polish population or Christians in the extermination of Jews. The third poem, which is a poem about also written in Warsaw, and also about Warsaw and the Holocaust, is this poem Przedmieście, and the comparison, in a way, spatial comparison of these three poems is something that shows a progression of thinking that Miłosz had about the issue of the extermination of the Jews in Warsaw. Because if you remember, Campo di Fiori is if you have Warsaw as a kind of a plain that Miłosz often kind of underlines how Warsaw is a plain of sand. We have Campo di Fiori, which is vertical. We have basically two walls. I mean, we have a monument of Giordano Bruno, who is in a way juxtaposed to the ghetto wall. We have Miłosz as witness, I mean narrator, as a witness, the poet as witness of this catastrophe, speaking at the end with his own voice. So he is kind of enraged indignant, horrified witness in that poem. In the second poem, this is a poem in which the poet, in a way, the narrator, descends underground. And this is a poem of doubt, of questioning, of the kind of fear, the voice of fear, and the question, are we the, am I a helper in that catastrophe? Then the third poem is a poem in which we have the narrator, because he writes we, showing a barren field, like a wasteland, just like from Eliot, a degeneration of kind of towards the end of the war, the lack of moral hope. So it is a satirical. It is as the first one. The first poem is incredibly high culture and high tone. The second is a really descent into religious questions and kind of a spiritual territory. The third one is an image of a kind of desolation, moral desolation that is caused by the war. Now, two issues that I would like to say apropos of that. These poems are the following. Very interesting thing was that Miłosz, and I learned it also from Aleksandra Kremer book, Miłosz did not like to read, especially Campo di Fiori, and never read in the United States. And the reason for it was that he always debated the fact, didn't want to have this poem to be embraced by the Jewish, very enthusiastic reaction to this poem. On the other hand, in Poland, this poem, the Polish public, questioned this poem very much, especially its realistic element, that is the carousel, people on the carousel enjoying enjoying themselves while they over the wall of there are people who are dying. So this is the issue of reception that is very important, and the ambivalence of Miłosz to talk about it, to kind of to have it for frequently read and discussed. The second poem, Poor Christian, also was a poem that did not, he didn't like to talk a lot about, though he respected it more than the first one. And there's an interesting paragraph in Renata Gorczyńska's conversations with him, in which he very typically, atypically to himself, but typically to this poem, refuses really the interpretation of that poem. So this is the issue of certain kind of ambivalence of Miłosz about this topic and these poems, and that ambivalence perhaps, and this is my last point, that ambivalence perhaps is also expressing the strange issue that these poems have, that is that they do not use the word a Jew. They use the word, in Campo di Fiori, you get the idea what he's writing about from the word the ghetto. In the second poem, you have a Jew is mentioned, but it is not to speak about a non-Jew, because this is the Jew of the New Testament. This is how narrator in a way presents himself. And then in the third poem, there is a building, a house is described as Jewish, and this is how we are brought into the topic. So my question is if the word Jew is a non-poetic word in a way, because in prose, Miłosz had no problem in using this word. And then he always underlined how difficult talking about it is. And since we have Renata Grudzińska here, I can finish with a conversation, with a quote from a conversation about that topic that Renata had with Miłosz, and in which he replies to a question of her. He says, the magnitude of the trauma of those times is a subject in itself. There was the ghetto, for God's sake, and the liquidation of 3 million Polish Jews. Actually, this is a certain issue of guilt that is laying on this soil, on the entire country, and cries out for some purification. And then at the end, he adds, this is a difficult subject to discuss. Thank you. Bozena, we can't hear you. We can't hear you.
I will step in here. It sounds like Bozena is having sound issues. Bozena, you may need to try to work that out with Esther and Matthew. If you can't, you might need to restart and rejoin. Without Bozena's steadfast presence, I'm sorry, I do not remember who comes next. So can I trust the?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think it's Łukasz. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, no, it's Aleksandra Kremer now.
It's Aleksandra. Yes, it's Aleksandra.
Oh, okay, Aleksandra.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be on this roundtable with so many Miłosz specialists. Actually, I just have one chapter about Miłosz in my forthcoming book. So a lot of what I will say today are really very fresh thoughts, and I look forward to hearing your questions and corrections. So it seems to me that in quite a few poems by Czesław Miłosz, we can see that one space, area, city, or landscape brings to mind associations with another one, but the description of one space leads us to another space and time, but the two are compared, juxtaposed, merged, or contrasted. And today I would like to focus on a few of such poems and see what they tell us about Miłosz's view of his European background, about the self-fashioning of his poetic voice. It seems to me that Miłosz is often presented as an author bridging the gap between Western and Eastern Europe, as someone who tried to emphasize the Latin and French influences on the culture of pre-war Lithuania and Poland. He's often cited in discussions about Central Europe as area closer to the West than to Russia. However, when we look more closely at some of Miłosz's poems, and I'm focusing today on poems, I guess that looking at his essays may sometimes bring slightly different results. But when we look at these poems, we may sometimes wonder what kind of a background they really provide for the poet, whether they indeed emphasize this region's links with the West, or the opposite, the distance, the peripheral and modern status of the region of his childhood, or even some pre-Christian beliefs he encountered in Lithuania. And this impression was especially striking to me when I listened to a few recordings of poetry readings that Miłosz gave in America in the 70s and 80s, during which some poems, together with his commentaries, seemed to provide such a primordial and traditional view of his Lithuanian roots. So, for example, in a well-known poem to Robinson Jeffers, Miłosz does not only contrast Californian and Lithuanian landscape, he also contrasts Jeffers's philosophy of inhumanism, his willingness to face the void and terror, with the anthropomorphic, homely, semi-pagan traditions from rural Lithuania, such as carving suns on the joints of crosses or naming trees. In another well-known poem, By Passing Through Descartes, the 20th century Paris, the center of European civilization and culture, as well as the universalist ideologies of the West more generally, are contrasted with the newcomers from the provinces and their old-fashioned local traditions, which actually turn out to be more lasting after the changes of power and bloodshed. In particular, the speaker of the poem himself comes from such provinces and seems to still believe in a Lithuanian taboo that warns against killing of water snakes. So such contrasts between unmodern beliefs stemming for the poet from Lithuania and the suspicious civilizing and modernizing powers and questions can also be found in another poem, Kabeca, which Miłosz read a couple of times at his first readings in the US. And this text has been reminded also in Cynthia Heaven's new book that we discussed yesterday. So in this poem, Kabeca, the Spanish conqueror and explorer of American Southwest in the 16th century, Alvar Kabeca, who represents the Spanish court, starts to see this court and the products of civilization as artificial and becomes closer to Native Americans. And the poem's speaker seems to share Kabeca's skepticism and doubts. So this interest in Kabeca is not really surprising when we realize that already in his book, The Native Realm, Miłosz compared Lithuanians to Native Americans, especially the situation of Lithuanians in Europe in late Middle Ages, with their pagan beliefs, brutal Christianization, and being perceived as barbarians. So in the text I quoted above, Miłosz does not really speak in the name of Western or European civilization and progress on behalf of Spain, France, or modern poetry. Instead, he emphasizes his affinities with more peripheral and unmodern cultures. And such thinking is also present in another poem, I Sleep a Lot, which also includes an indirect analogy between Lithuanians and American indigenous people, as has been noted by Claire Kavanagh and then by Cynthia Heaven. So in this text, the speaker's old beliefs in spells and incantations, which we can associate again with Lithuanian heritage, make him look for help among American Indian folk healers. Such similarities between Lithuanian culture of Miłosz's childhood and some other place, some other culture, aren't really common in Miłosz's work, so that's really interesting. Or perhaps one more example of an indirect positive analogy across time and space can be felt in the poem Mittelbergheim, much earlier from 51, which is now leading us to Europe, where a simple traditional Alsatian village allows the speaker to rest and to feel at home, as if by analogy to the simple ways of rural life he knew from Lithuania. So Miłosz read all of his poems in English in America, and these analogies between modern cultures and modern beliefs provided an intriguing background for Miłosz at these American readings, especially when they were additionally supplemented by poems assuming a childlike perspective, like Bobo's Metamorphosis, or poems discussing a naive belief in angels as winged creatures, and as all of this was accompanied by his strong Slavic accent. So, of course, when giving these readings, Miłosz was an American white citizen, a tenured professor, and even in categories from before his emigration, he was a member of intelligentsia stemming from Polonized nobility. Yet the analogies he built in these emigre poems seem to play much more with the stereotypes about immature and backward Eastern Europe and its peasant population, almost by taking this stereotype to the extreme and turning it into some idealized, mythical, exoticized images of primordial nature and spells. And at the same time, it seems to me that the use of Lithuanian references allowed Miłosz to avoid associations with other East Europeans in the US, that is Polish Americans, with whom, as we know, he did not identify and his relations were complicated, though Poland could serve as a source for some of his East European images as well. And actually, such views of Poland in relation to the rest of Europe, in relation to the West, did appear in some of Miłosz's earlier poems from the 30s and 40s, poems which haven't been translated to English, and in which Poland's underdevelopment and peripheral status is not as idealized as in Lithuanian images, though the poems also share a critical view of civilizing powers. So one such text in my rough translation says about interwar Poland that, I quote, "This land is flat and poor for the travelers from Moscow to Berlin," and calls it the French capital's colony. Another poem from the 30s juxtaposes beautiful Siena in Italy with poor and hardworking Silesia in Poland. A text from the late 1940s juxtaposes the overworked 19th century analphabetic Polish immigrants to the US with the exploitation of African Americans. Yet another text discusses Polish Americans in Pennsylvania who teach their daughter never to admit her East European origins. But these were, of course, not the poems that Miłosz would read in the US, and he also did not republish them too frequently in Polish. But disregarding these differences between the presentation of Poland and Lithuania, all in all, it seems that there are very few Miłosz's poems that do not really emphasize this peripheral position of his background, whether it's Poland or Lithuania, that really allow him to speak for the whole Europe, undivided Europe, and in the name of European civilization. And strikingly, it seems to me that poems that do so, such poems, seem to mostly come from the 40s and the context of World War II and the Holocaust. And the first such text that comes to mind is something that has already been discussed by Professor Grudzińska-Gross, Campo di Fiori from 1943, a poem that again creates an analogy between two spaces of Rome and Warsaw. So in this text, as we know, we read about the passive crowd and people having fun in Warsaw on the Aryan side while facing the burning Warsaw ghetto. And this is compared to indifferent Roman crowd looking at the burning of Giordano Bruno in 1600. So this reference to Giordano Bruno is usually seen as an important cultural analogy, showing the common indifference and complicity across time and space. However, the poem does not only provide a new lens for viewing events in Warsaw, it is also a new way of viewing Rome, something that I learned from Cecily Tsai, who was my former student and now an assistant professor. So this image of Rome from 43 differs a lot from young Miłosz's trip to Italy in 37, when he was again a newcomer from the provinces admiring Italian art and architecture of this old cultural center. Now Rome is viewed through the lens of religious exclusion and indifference. And in this evil way, Rome and Warsaw are actually comparable, analogous, equal. Similarly, in a slightly later and bitterly ironic poem, The Child of Europe, the lessons of cynical survival acquired during the war belong to, I quote, inheritor of Gothic cathedrals, of Baroque churches, who has an elegant skeptical mind. So the evil lessons, again, are shared across Europe, especially non-Jewish Europe. And finally, in the poem Earth, Miłosz characterizes Europe as my sweet European homeland, again, undivided, as a place where blood gathers in the mouths of tulips, and it is no shame to suffer. So it is striking that Miłosz was ready to treat his background as European with no further qualifications when he focused on wartime evil, or maybe in a more positive manner also in his half-ironic poem, The World, a poem similarly written during the war and in response to the war. Yet when speaking of other topics, especially at his American readings, Miłosz emphasized instead his provincial background. He re-evaluated this periphery and also distanced himself from European, Western, more generally civilization. And he did so by analogies and contrasts between different spaces in his poems that I showed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for sticking to the time limit. Our next presenter is Professor Łukasz Tischner. Can you hear me, Łukasz? I had
yes, I do. Yes, you. Can you hear me as well?
Yes,
Yes, okay.
Quite a while I was off the audio. So why don't you start your presentation?
Okay, good evening. Well, thank you very much for invitation. I really feel honored to be here. And I will try to give a small contribution. Well, I intend to discuss ideas, but I will try to place them in a geographical space, more or less. So my admiration for Czesław Miłosz is multifaceted, but one of the main reasons why I keep reading his poetry and essays is his stubborn but fragile search for a second space. What makes his quest so vital is that Miłosz labels himself a citizen of disenchanted world, but doesn't accept constraints of so-called immanent frame, as Charles Taylor named a dominant modern social imaginary, which dismisses any reference to something outside a natural order. Miłosz opposes what he calls the serenity of faith and claims to be a wanderer on the outskirts of heresy, but nevertheless portrays himself as a Christian of weak faith. Quotation, one day I believe, another I disbelieve. It is quotation from Treatise on Theology. A dialogue on Miłosz's backgrounds can't overlook his lifelong meditation on religion, the one that originated in his Vilnius years. In my short talk, I would like to mention figures who shaped Miłosz's view on religion in his youth and old age. The number of theologians, mystics, and religious thinkers who inspired Miłosz is overwhelming. Oscar Miłosz, Thomas Aquinas, Isaac Luria, William Blake, Blaise Pascal, Jacques Maritain, Simone Weil, Lev Shestov, to mention a few. But in my view, it is William James and Marian Jacobski who are the two thinkers who influenced Miłosz's religious backgrounds the most. Why do I dare to say so? Because their impact was decisive and appeared on various stages of Miłosz's intellectual life. I find it also intriguing that they represent Eastern Europe and United States, his native realm and the place of his exile. In case of Jacobski, it is particularly significant because the Polish philosopher was a legend of two cities. Kraków, where around 1902, Miłosz's mother attended his famous lectures on religious pessimism, and Vilnius, Wilno, where in late 1920s, Czesław Miłosz met Jacobski as the rector of his university and a somehow bizarre man, but stimulating thinker. As it happened, Czesław Miłosz spent his youth in Vilnius, Wilno, and Kraków became his home in his last decade of life. If we follow chronology, it is William James whom Miłosz encountered first. He mentioned several times that reading The Varieties of Religious Experience was a turning point for his intellectual development. He discovered that religion is not eradicated by the progress of natural sciences. One can mention in passing that he was not an exception. Hans Joas, in his recent book, The Power of the Sacred, noted that James's book received enthusiastic responses by Max Weber, Emile Durkheim, Henri Bergson, Rudolf Otto, Paul Tillich, Max Scheler, and Ludwig Wittgenstein. The Miłosz's most exhaustive statement on James is his essay Beyond Truth and Falsehood, written in occupied Warsaw, probably 1942. This text may be misleading if we consider a total James's impact on Miłosz, because here the American philosopher is mainly exorcised as someone who contributed to irrational currents in European culture, the currents which Miłosz accused of being responsible for the rise of Nazism. Apparently, after the war, Miłosz felt discomfort reading his essay and published it only in 1996, when the book The Legends of Modernity was eventually printed. Remorse is evident in his comment on the Warsaw essays written in 1957, quotation, "A born intuitionist, I had to torment myself by turning against those currents of intuitionism that I suspected of complicity in turning the so-called European culture into a mirage, into a land of delusion, the consequences of which were experienced firsthand," the end of quotation. It could be tedious to analyze Miłosz's direct statements of James. Instead, I propose to recall basic ideas of James's philosophy of religion, which resonate in Miłosz's poetry and prose. First of all, James focuses on the religion of so-called sick souls, contrasted to healthy-minded. There's an irony in James's view because he privileges sick souls as individuals who are confronted with unavoidable melancholy of modernity, with a despair which implies implosion of meaning, as described by Nietzsche. Commenting on the nature of modern melancholy, James refers to experience of evil, suffering, and cruelty in the world. The Varieties of Religious Experience shows that he praises religious views of the twice born, it's his term, of the people who strived with modern melancholy and eventually overcame it. What is a Copernican revolution achieved by James is the phenomenology of religious experience, which welcomes all possible appearances of sacred and suspends the question of objective reality of these experiences. As I already mentioned, the subjective burden of James' philosophy of religion was contested in Legends of Modernity, but Miłosz never managed to content himself with neo-scholastic attempts to prove God's objective existence. James strongly emphasizes volitional aspect of religious experience, what nevertheless doesn't support, in his view, the belief that God is an illusion. In fact, James, who was a far grandson of Pascal, juxtaposes claims of reason with reasons of heart and proves that for a religious person, heart is not only a source of affects, but also a cognitive disposition confirming, quotation, reality of a contact with God. Let me now introduce Marian Jacobski. He was also a thinker who appears in Legends of Modernity, but the essay Jacobski's Religiosity doesn't consist of accusations similar to these which aimed at the father of pragmatism. It is quite puzzling, given the affinities between irrationality of James and Jacobski. The Polish thinker was a key figure among the followers of so-called Catholic modernism, which was condemned by Pope Pius X in 1907. It is worth mentioning by passing that in 1904, Jacobski attended an audience with Pope Pius X to plead for more openness towards modernist ideas. In his wartime essay, Miłosz is reluctant to unconditionally praise Catholic modernism. After all, however, he expresses deep admiration for Jacobski. Quotation: "The modernists and the sympathizers, like Jacobski, were the last religious thinkers, not Catholic philosophers, but truly thinkers who probed the meaning of religion. Standing beneath a starry sky or experiencing empathy for the suffering of a fly is a phenomenon that lies at the birth of faith and rituals, whereas St. Thomas' judgments are only one of the ways to codify metaphysical dread." End of quotation. Justifying his sympathy for Catholic modernism, Miłosz explains what was the reason for his rejection of Neo-Thomism as influential current of Polish Catholicism before the Second World War. Now quotation from Miłosz. "The majority of Catholics who promoted St. Thomas grounded their Catholicism with the help of socio-political inferences, with the help of a vision of a new Middle Ages that could be incarnated only by relying on a Catholic worldview. It is not at all surprising that those Catholics linked St. Thomas with ideas taken from fascism, because at bottom, without realizing it, they accepted Catholicism as one more fiction, useful for the goals of the political structure." The end of quotation. Miłosz returned to his university professor in his old age, writing a moving poem entitled Jacobski. Let me now summarize what was the nature of influence that Miłosz owed to the rector of the Vilnius University. Miłosz was mainly impressed by the paradoxical nature of Jacobski's religious thought, which implied coexistence of ultimate rational doubt and a religious, heartfelt passion. This aporia is evident in a quote from Jacobski, which appears in the Miłosz poem. Here's this quotation: "There is no God, both nature and history cry out loud, but their voice is submerged in the harmony of psalms and hymns, and by the avowal coming from the depths of the spirit, that the human soul without God is like earth without water. God is, yet the fact of God's existence is beyond grasp." Yet the fact of God's existence is beyond grasp. God is a miracle. The reasons for Miłosz's intellectual kinship with Jacobski, however, are more numerous. Another one is connected with a Manichaean tendency in Jacobski's thought, his doubt in goodness of creation. As a Catholic, he tried to reconcile his view with some theological ideas borrowed from Orthodox thinkers, especially Vladimir Soloviev, who supplemented Christianity with elements of Gnosticism.
Excuse me, Łukasz. Excuse me. Could you just shorten?
Yes, it is last paragraph now. Yes, okay.
Oh,
so most courageous theological views of Jacobski concerned possible salvation of all creation from ants to human beings. And his famous essay on cruelty proves that Jacobski was not only equipped with a great wisdom, but also with a gift of compassion. His rebel against meaningless suffering and cruelty in the world forced him to reject traditional theology, which was indifferent towards animal pain. Maybe later I will comment on it, but I think that it's very good experiment to read very special poem by Czesław Miłosz, An Alcoholic Enters the Gates of Heaven, having in mind ideas both of William James and Marian Jacobski. So thank you very much. Maybe later on I could comment something more. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And we are a little bit pressed for time. Our next presenter is ready. And Professor Zach, you are welcome.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for joining this meeting. Since we didn't know each other's topic, we have to cope with discrepancies that occur. I want to share with you some remarks gathered under the title Mind in Captivity, Mind in Exile. I was inspired by the theme of the conference, but also by the conversation with Professor Nicol, who pointed to the Notes on Exile as an important text from his point of view. So I want to recall the concept of captivity and exile as reflected upon by Czesław Miłosz, of course, in a vast body of text, but here referring to the Notes on Exile. And since the notes were written in 1975 in Berkeley, it would be perfectly justified, I think, to make some references, if the time allows, to the Land of Ulro, which was written shortly afterwards, or even simultaneously in the same place. To understand those concepts within their original context is the necessary condition to move forward. But what interests me here is the question whether and how do they apply to our contemporary situation? And if they do, to what extent Miłosz envisaged or even prophesied, if you wish, a transformation of social context which gives the concept their meaning, the context in which they occur. So every reader of Miłosz would notice instantly that mind in captivity points to the captive mind, to his captive mind. It's absolutely crucial to grasp that Miłosz in his book focuses on the internal damages suffered by an individual human being due to his or her ideological engagement, rather than on the external means of physical oppression. He knew perfectly well that fear, imprisonment, and torture can easily crush people, and many people were crushed, if not annihilated. But playing with the devil, or even practicing Ketman, might have no less severe and more durable consequences for the entire culture. By playing with the devil, I do not necessarily mean engaging with the metaphysical aspect of evil. It is enough to say that it's next to impossible to recognize a full potential of powerful ideas, including their destructive potential, of course. Thus, playing with the devil may simply mean playing with the unknown. Miłosz wanted to know. He wanted to trace back the roots of the ideas of his time, to understand how they shaped the world and how they transformed the mind. The Land of Ulro was thus a follow-up of the captive mind, a passionate exercise in understanding. And I remember a beautiful poem by Adam Zagajewski, reading Miłosz, czytając Miłosza. Znów czytam pańskie wiersze spisane przez bogacza, który wszystko zrozumiał, i przez biedaka, któremu odebrano dom. I'm reading you poems again, written by a rich man who's understood everything, and a poor one deprived of his home. Anyway, Miłosz approaches the ideas of his age with a deep insight into internal dynamic of civilization. Hence, by reading him, one can acquire some knowledge of history as a complex and multi-layer fabric, the threads of which are never fully understood, and many issues that may affect the future, directly or indirectly, are never properly properly resolved, but merely swept or swept under the carpet. In our times, we encounter new forms of mental captivity in different parts of the world, as well as barely transformed old forms, rehearsed and exercised in the past. They are abundant in liberal democratic societies, not only in those who merely emerge from the oppressive regimes. A clear division between free and flourishing countries on one side and the oppressive ones on the other no longer holds in that respect, the existence of brutal political regimes notwithstanding. There is a captivity, for example, in the way a freedom of speech is sometimes understood or executed. And there is an exilic dimension in our domesticated ways of life. The issue at stake, as far as I understand Miłosz, is the meaning of human life, the overcoming of the state of estrangement from the self, or at least a conscious and conscientious existence in a world of globalized fear and globalized power. Miłosz starts his notes on exile from a kind of cliché remark. It's not the first, but the second note, entitled Paradigm. I quote, "He was aware of his task and people were waiting for his words, but he was forbidden to speak. Now where he lives, he is free to speak, but nobody listens. And moreover, he forgot what he had to say." End of quote. We can easily discover here a set of traditional oppositions: censorship versus free speech, homelessness versus belonging, etc. Be it as it may, communities of shared beliefs and shared values were already undermined in Miłosz's times, and a reference to an oppressive regime indicated in that note above does not provide a remedy to the erosion of meaningful dialogue. A common enemy unites people around a common cause, but only up to a point and for a short period of time. There is, of course, a more important dimension of a shared cultural tradition inherent in the language, but even that may be subject to erosion, its deeper layers being less and less accessible to the public. What I'm trying to say is that new lenses, new eyes, and new perspective acquired by Miłosz in exile, not merely by being accustomed to it, but due to the overcoming of the initial state of loss and confusion, enabled him to penetrate the process, which was already advanced in his times, the process of losing the grounds for meaningful communication, the process which he recognized as inherent in the very dynamic of Western civilization. Thus, soon enough, in his notes on exile, Miłosz comes up with a question. I quote, "Isn't the same tongue just an illusion where uncountable individual languages fill the space with a jamming noise?" End of quote. And this is exactly where we are, except that we try to disregard the issue and nobody seems to care about the jamming noise or to keep track of global market of ideas. Miłosz spoke of spiritual exile of modern man, the exile from one's heritage, from steadfast points of reference, from the sense of belonging, and ultimately from oneself, which led to the distortion of the very meaning of what actually makes us humans. We are homeless in our homes as long as culture does not provide us with space for thinking in full dimensions, forward and upward. And I quote, "A man must abide somewhere. A physical roof above his head is not enough. His mind needs its bearings, its points of reference, vertically as well as horizontally. Coming to an end, not only did Miłosz provide a profound and prophetic insight into the erosive process of disintegration we witness today, but also he sought a remedy and the way out. The way out, according to him, requires a recreation of human space, and first of all, a renewal of vertical dimension. I will end with a quote from Roberto Calasso that corresponds very well to the coda of that's abbreviation, of course, but it's very up-to-date correspondence to Miłosz's ideas. From the book Innominabile Attuale, which may be translated The Unnamed Present. It seems that after thousands of years, our imagination has renounced or abjured the capacity to reach beyond society in search for something that would give or provide meaning to what is going on within society. The inspiration to reach farther must come from somewhere else, and the poetic imagination must indispensably go beyond everything we have so scrupulously crafted to our limitations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Zak. And our last speaker tonight is Renata Grudzińska. I hope you can hear us. Oh, here you are. So, the floor is
yours. Can you hear me? Unmute myself, okay. Thanks, it works. Hello, dear friends and colleagues, and very special greetings for Lilian Vallet, who was actually my first cicerone in Vilnius, actually, in 2001. Since then, I visited the city without a name 4 more times, searching for Miłosz's presence there. The poet wrote in his Californian poem that he was never able to leave his Vilna, though he had left it contrary to his wishes. And then he became like a ball thrown in different directions. This is true, actually. In his entire ever, Vilna is his point of reference, his compass, his light in darkness. The very first poem Miłosz published in 1930 is an academic in an academic journal, dealt with Vilna. It is entitled A Composition and is a description of a Sunday Mass in one of the 40 Vilna churches. The monk from the pulpit declares that death is sin. The church, I was able to decipher which one Miłosz had in mind, turns then into a theater filled with torsos of young men. In one of his last poems, written in his 90s, Miłosz reminisces on the city of his youth, but this time his memory is filled with pain. Persona tells of his unspecified sufferings there. Throughout decades of writing, Miłosz behaved as if gifted with bilocation. At the same time, he was able to be at 2 different places, Vilna, naturally, and let's say the valley. While traveling by car, a narrator, all of a sudden young again, is at the students' ball in Vilna University. In my opinion, the key word in his association is death. The lush landscape of Lithuania has nothing in common with the arid space of Death Valley. In World War II, so many people were killed there that is why he thinks about their death. And also, he believed then that his former fiancée, lover, Jadwiga, also lost her life then. He was mistaken, but that's another story. For years, Jadwiga in his poems was presented as a spirit from afterlife. I wonder why he entitled his long poem and the book itself as City Without Name. It seems to me it was too sacred to him to utter it. As in Judaism, we mustn't use the name of the deity. Also, it was off limits to him. Vilnius became the capital of the Lithuanian Republic, incorporated into the Soviet Union. So the poet was able to visit his native realm 50 years after his self-exile from Poland, and recounted that visit in a longish poem. Yet he reconstructed every detail his memory prompted him. His descriptive aspects of the places he used to live are amazing. I wonder how foreign readers of his poems deal with all these mind-boggling names of localities as Szatejnie, his birthplace, or Opitołoki, Wędziagoła, Świętobrość, and so on. And also streets in Wilno, Nadbrzeżna, Podgórna, Portowa. But in my point of view, it wasn't a question of sentimental feelings of an émigré longing for the land of his youth. Miłosz believes in apocastasis. I never know where to put the stress on. The idea that after the total disintegration, there is a way to reincarnate the whole world with every single being there. Miłosz spent in Wilno less than 20 formative years, always in rented apartments, rooms, dormitories, at times with distant relatives. His parents moved to other towns in 1926. Recently, I realized that his first own house he bought while in France was when he was 42. It was a dilapidated dwelling in a village near Paris. He had to start from the beginning, as most émigrés do. It was a life on a shoestring, taking into account that he had to provide for his wife and 2 children. Maybe this is also a reason that in his poems, he never left Wilno. But in reality, he was forced to do it when in 1937, he was expelled from the Vilnius public radio for his leftist leanings and interests in ethnic mosaic in the city. On several occasions, Miłosz stressed that his emigrations started with that fateful event. A year before Miłosz published his second volume of poetry, 3 Winters, a brilliant and powerful collection of poems, as we know, he was cut off from his place, had to move to Warsaw, where he was offered a job at the Warsaw Public Radio. He knew the Polish capital because he had spent a year there studying law at the Warsaw University. Yet he felt alien there, and in new surroundings, he lost his poetic powers, at least to a certain extent. His poems written in late 30s and early 40s seem like a regress in comparison with those written mostly in Vilna between 1932-35. In a way, it proves the city fed his imagination.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Yes. I have to be brutal. But
Yes.
Yeah.
I have to finish.
Yes, please.
All right. May I have just the last sentence? That the emigre poets merge two countries into a new entity. That would be a kind of a simple explanation of the way Miłosz formed his poetry. But it has also kind of a metaphysical ceiling on it. And besides, exiled writers feeling alienated have at the same time the power to look at the new country with a new point of view. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have 15 minutes for our discussion, and I would like to encourage first questions that can be more or less limited to the panelists. If you have questions for other panelists, please go ahead, and then we will include questions that will be sent as messages.
Bozena, can I interject that we can go a little past? We can go a little past. So
all right.
Let's say at least 5 minutes, maybe even a bit more if we need. Okay, if we get a good discussion going, let's not cut it off. Okay?
I figured out that it will be longer.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, any comments, any questions? If not, let me begin. I just wanted very briefly to ask Laimonas Briedis whether indeed you think that there is no presence of Jewish Vilna in Miłosz's works. At least one of his essays invokes the image of the city as full of Jewish bookstores, old bookstores, as this kind of a Jerusalem in the East, and as the place where where books are still cultivated. Well, there are more than this, just this particular image. There is more, actually. Perhaps those who met Miłosz can add how often he actually would refer to the city as having a major population, Jewish population. In Clermont during the Miłosz festival in 1998, Miłosz gathered a small group of listeners and talked about the Jewish Vilna. It was something that definitely was not excluded, erased, omitted, whatever. And my last question is, you said that there are no traces of Polish presence in Vilna. Could you also?
I didn't mean that way. I meant when in the Soviet period, there were definitely, but it wasn't present as Polish, let's put it that way. So officially not talking.
Yeah, but I am talking about the material trace.
Yeah, no, of course.
Vestiges of the, yeah. of the Baroque architecture, and not only. Anyway.
I just briefly about I'm absolutely, you're right. I didn't mean to say that Miłosz was not aware or did not speak or didn't even write. And you mentioned about the books, bookstores of and some poems. But I think one thing that it came to our discussion is that about the witnessing of the destruction, so to speak. And as we know, Miłosz only, so to speak, learn and from about the destruction of Vilna and Vilna rather than experience. And I think so his probably relationship with the place, perhaps we can, argue that's a little bit different than, for example, from Warsaw. But I was really impressed by Renata's notion that this I always was wondering too, why did he call his poem City Without a Name? And I think there's sort of evocation about this kind of that in Judaism you don't call name the holiest of the whole. I think it's really very striking, and maybe that is the answers.
Very possible. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? No, we have no comments. No questions.
Just this, thank you for my participation in your panel. I really not only enjoyed it, but also learned quite a lot from my colleagues. So that was important. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to give another opportunity to Łukasz Tischner, who said that he would like to conclude his presentation. So could you please do it now?
Can you see me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, I also really enjoyed all the voices. It's very polyphonic. It's difficult to find just one line, but I'm really impressed. So, well, what I wanted to offer like an experiment is to read this poem by Miłosz, An Alcoholic Enters the Gates of Heaven, where in fact names of Jacobski or James doesn't appear, but you can feel the presence in a sense. So especially I think it's quite significant how does Miłosz play with the words hope, illusion, delusion, and illusion or delusion as the result of alcoholic addiction is somehow equal to religious faith. But at the same time, well, you have this very title, An Alcoholic Enters the Gates of Heaven. That means that in a sense, this poem, well, suggests that the salvation really happens. So it's a very paradoxical poem, but I think that it's very, well, special when you read it, having Jacobski's and James's ideas in mind. And last comment I wanted also to add is that I strongly recommend a new book on Miłosz, but not only on Miłosz. It's on T.S. Eliot and Rilke and Miłosz, seen through the lens of theology. It's called Modernism and Theology, Rainer Maria Rilke, T.S. Eliot, Czesław Miłosz. It's newly published by Joanna and it's very, I think, important book also for the experts of Miłosz, because she tries to give the re-evaluation of European modernism by means of introducing its theological sources, sometimes sources which were somehow hidden or rejected. So that's my comment.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. And we have a question from Stanley Bill. Welcome. Hello, Stanley.
Hello, I think Karina Jagiellonska might have been before me. I don't want to, hello everybody. Karina, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did have a question, but you were first, actually.
It wasn't recorded. Okay.
Oh, really? Hi, Karina. I just wanted to ask Łukasz very briefly then about the Eastern dimension of Czechowski in Miłosz's thinking. It's something that I'm quite interested in, the way in which when Miłosz uses a thinker for a purpose, there's often more than one purpose involved, and there's often a kind of strategy involved. And in this case, the fact that Czechowski is this voice in the wilderness and the far eastern parts of the doomed interwar republic, who has experience of the East, as Miłosz describes that, who writes about Russia, who writes about so-called Russian influences on the Polish soul, as is the title of one of his books. And therefore, this understanding of the problem of evil is related to an understanding of the East, right? And this obviously, this idea has a tradition stretching back at least to the end of the 18th century in Polish culture. And I wonder whether you have any thoughts about that context around Czechowski, which I find interesting.
Łukasz?
Thank you very much. So am I now to answer? Yes, okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Bill, very much. It's very well challenging question. And in fact, I think it's you who could answer it better. I remember your wonderful text on Miłosz and well, Eastern influences in his Manichaean and Gnostic affinities. But well, to put it, well, trying to put it somehow shortly, but with that impression that I can't really do it well now, I would say that well, Czechowski and I mean the Czechowski's reading of Orthodox theology was very special for Miłosz because, well, especially Vladimir Soloviev, and his idea of Sophia, which was somehow transported from Jewish Kabbalistic idea of Shekinah. It was kind of a phenomenon that somehow was designed as the mediator between God and this, well, somehow evil world, crippled world. And it was the way how Soloviev tried to, well, balance his Gnostic, I would say, outlooks with Orthodox religion. And it was also the direction where Czechowski tried to go. And I think that it was also something that that really fascinated Miłosz. But of course, you're right that there is a contradiction in Miłosz's view on the East, where political ideas well, meet or juxtapose theological ideas, and there's always, or maybe not always, but often kind of a clash. So that's my, well, quick answer, but very superficial.
Which do you take more seriously, the political or the theological context, Łukasz?
Sorry, can you repeat it?
Which do you take more seriously in these works, the political or the I mean, or do you simply, are you understanding it as a clash that isn't resolved and there's no primacy of one of those dimensions over the other?
I try to look at it from more theological angle, but also with the presumption that probably this political view of Miłosz is somehow fueled by his resentment against Russia as the imperial country. Thank you.
Thank you. No further questions, Stanley? No. All right. Now, with apologies to Karina Jagiellonska, I didn't notice the yellow hand. So now you may ask your questions.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to thank Aleksandra Kremer for her speech and this comparison between how Miłosz treated Polish and Lithuanian, like pre-modern or like other modernity maybe, in relation to Western modernity. And I was wondering if you, Aleksandra, when we were searching for those representations, have you noticed that those like idealistic affirmative visions of this pre-modern Lithuanian culture or customs are only like after Second World War present in Miłosz's work, or are there any examples of it before the war? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So this is a great question. That's why I kind of said that I'm kind of afraid of making bigger statements. I was, really browsing through collected poems in Polish, but I still imagine that, there might be something I've missed. And this was exactly one of the questions I've been asking myself. And to some extent, it seems to me that it appears more strongly after the war, and especially after his emigration. So, some of his poems I quoted that were still more concerning Poland or Polish Americans came from this period when he still was a cultural attaché of the communist government. And it's only in a sense when he came back to America later in a different role that he started to kind of mythicize these Lithuanian roots a bit more. But I'm not sure if I would make at the same time this very kind of strong division between these different epochs, because even in his pre-war poetry, there are also poems, maybe not speaking directly about Lithuania, but say about peasants or kind of more rural scenes, which also get this kind of more sacred or harmonious look. And I guess it might be partly also the difference simply between, Lithuania being the place of his childhood, whereas Poland being more of a place to which he moved later, maybe between these rural motifs and perhaps some unfinished industrialization would be something more associated with Poland. So I guess there is more to this. So some roots of this thinking of this juxtaposition, I think, are already there before the war, but this full kind of magic-like mythicization, I think, happens only afterwards. But this is like a very, preliminary answer.
Thank you. I don't see more questions. If this is the case, we actually are a little bit over time, not much, by 2 minutes. I therefore would like to stop our session, our meeting, and we will start at 2:15. So it's less than a quarter of an hour. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was wonderful. I hope that the contraction of time didn't make people, reticent when it came to asking questions. I actually have a question, but I decided I wanted to leave the space open. So I'll start the next panel with my question or my comment. I don't know if it's a question. Okay, we'll see you all in a few minutes.